Intersection Magazine Podcast.
Magazine podcast. This week I'll be talking about of course technology and innovation, but I wanted to talk about a little about, I suppose, the political landscape that sometimes governs and determines how effective your innovation and technology ecosystem is going to function. Now I'm doing this because I've mentioned before in my writings, especially about Nigeria, for example, and Kenya, about how there's several parts, at least it is reported, there's several parts of, for example, Nigeria, that are not easy to do business in. There are historical reasons for it. Some of it has to do with culture, religion, faith, language. Others have to do with resources. While in Kenya, the issues vary, but mainly politics, religion, a little bit about the colonial past. And some of these issues come into play when you talk about how effective a country can be in terms of its business operations and its openness to the outside world. So that's pretty much part of the discussion. Now, there is a part of me that has wrestled with this idea before, thinking that maybe I should have a separate podcast dealing entirely with politics, but the broader picture is, if we're going to talk about innovation and technology, maybe we could be thinking about solutions also that have to do with governance and politics. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. So first I want to give you a story about the country in which I believe I currently reside. About, maybe 2-3 years ago, there was a crisis in one of our western kingdoms, or the kingdoms in the western part of the country. Now there's a bit of history in terms of how this kingdom was actually established. I suppose if you go a little bit back, you'll find the Toro kingdom that goes far back, and then a couple of more kingdoms emerged or were formed out of that structure. One of those is currently being run by a king called Mumbere, or Charles Mumbere. Now there was a crisis in the kingdom that those who were present claim or talk about, that necessitated an intervention by the government. And in many circles it was perceived as being more like an invasion. In fact, some likened it to what happened in Uganda in the 60s, when the kingdom palace was attacked. Now, some people who live in the area mentioned that for a while those who are part of the palace guard had began to take advantage of their position in the kingdom and were misusing their power in their locality. The other part that some people have mentioned was that the king was actually under siege. Now, the images and the stories and the deaths that emerge from that attack are well documented in many media outlets, and there are scars, historical scars, of the people of that area. recently one of the people, or one of the generals that was in charge of that operation was received, I suppose, a travel ban, I believe from the UK and the US. But part of his justification was some of what I mentioned, as well as some conversations that I had with certain people in that area about a kingdom under siege, and then a group of palace guards that had become a nuisance and that were beyond the control of the kingdom. Now put that aside as I tell you another story, this time about a president. I believe his name was Ali Bongo, his father was Omar Bongo, and after about, I suppose, 50 years in power, one of those who was in charge of protecting the president and a group of his military officials captured him and forced him out of power and created some form of transitional government. Now, I suppose some of those who live in the area and who are quite exhausted about a family being in charge for so long and seeming to involve themselves in the misuse of resources and creating power centers around those resources, felt a sense of gladness. Others were a little bit more concerned. On social media there was actually a song and a lot of memes that came about because the president had called for people, or the president then in a captive had called for people to make some noise so that he could get himself released. Images emerged from the presidential palace showing stacks and stacks of cash, dollars that it is said that he had amassed. Now I'm connecting these two stories, one from Kasese in Uganda, the second one from a nation in West Africa, a former French colony, to talk about the possibility that many of us or some of you are facing, which is, what do you do if your kingdom, if your presidency, if your home is under siege? Who do you call? If the stories that came from Kasese are correct, does it justify the use of the military to rescue the king? And if the king is rescued, what does that mean? Or why does the king then have to be thrown in jail for quite an elongated period of time? When you come to the other issue of Guinea, or rather the other country, God heavens help me if I remember the name of the country, the issue is a little bit more complex. You want to establish relationships with a country based on people that you trust. This is the same case with what we see happening in the US with the Republicans and the Democrats and governments all over. And usually these relationships are established with people that are elected into political office, whether they be presidents, whether they be kings, whether they be rulers. They end up controlling a major part of trade. Part of the reason why people are ready to do business with those that are in charge is because there's at least a sense of trust. At least there's a visibility that people that are in office or that are in politics or that are in parliament seem to have, that makes them suitable candidates for business. if the system exists in which these people can be observed and vetted and put into positions of power by merit, and if the people that you put into these positions are well versed with business, then I guess the system works. But there's a challenge, because it's very difficult to find yourself in a place where you're benefiting financially to be willing to go back to the place where you can be in a position of service, where you're presenting yourself as a servant of the people and not necessarily one who has competing interests in business as well as interests in governance. And maybe this is why there's a noticeable trend, for example, in Kenya and in Uganda, where the presidents seem to be micromanagers. Maybe they find themselves forced to be part of every small deal, every selection process, every election process, every deal, because there's a general lack of trust with those who they appoint. And maybe this is where the citizenry comes in, although that's a bit of a long shot in these parts. There's a lot less respect for the chicken thief, a lot more respect for the one who steals with a suit and has a convoy. He's, in a sense, a bit of an icon. When we covered Nigeria and the ecosystem there, as well as Kenya, we talked about how the political environment in those countries affects one's ability to do business there and to invest. The lack of, or the perception that the government will not be in power very long, prevents the country from establishing business interests for the long term. But it also creates an opportunity, if the chaos is extensive, it also creates an opportunity, as may be the case in Congo, where foreign companies can just come in and have a field day, looting and taking resources that are actually meant to benefit the citizenry. Somalia is a bit of an interesting case for what we see as terrorism. They have, for I suppose in the early or late 80s, early 90s, they created a system, or they lived in a system in which there was almost no such thing as a government, but yet people traveled, businesses functioned, life went on. So there's a case study there too about whether governments are actually needed in some areas, in some places. Now, when you're talking about technology and innovation ecosystems, of course I mentioned you need educators and a good education system. You need companies, you need non-governmental organizations, you need business people, you need incubators or accelerators, or I suppose we could call those business support organizations. You need quite a number of players. But the noticeable thing about Nigeria and Kenya that I mentioned was in the areas where there was a perception that there was an instability in most cases those regions atrophied. So the question is, where can you find, or what can you do to ensure that your ecosystem is favorable for business and is unaffected by politics? I heard a story about a man who established a plantation in South America for bananas. And because his business was so successful, when the political situation in the country was not favorable for his business, he put together a small militia and invaded the country and replaced the government. Maybe that's a bit extreme. But maybe for those who are interested in the progress, the development, and the uplifting of their own people, will be in some areas forced to take extreme measures. Let's leave it up to you to decide.